Alex Thompson, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation because I have many questions that I want to answer, many of which are answered in your excellent book, but some of which are not. The first thing I want to ask is, you're somebody who is reporting on politics very closely over the last years. What was the first moment when you grew to be concerned about Joe Biden's, mental state?
It was late 2021, and it was because, and I wrote a story about it at the time, that Joe Biden, Joe Biden has been in Washington since 1973, and he was the easiest quote in town for many of those decades. To the point that reporters, when they would see Joe Biden, they would walk the other way because they knew that if they asked him a question, he would be talk for 45 minutes. And yet, by the end of his first year as president, he had given fewer interviews and fewer press conferences than any president of the modern era in many, many, many decades. And I thought that was it. It was more observational than investigative, but it was this really stunning. I think it was like by the end of the first year, he had done just like around a dozen, maybe a little over a dozen interviews with reporters. And ultimately that would actually grow out. Like, he is the first president, maybe ever, but certainly in decades, to never have done a sit down interview with reporters at the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, or even Reuters. And that to me was telling, that they were protecting, they were protecting him. And then I remember still like it was this, I think, offhand moment when Press Secretary Jen Psaki mentioned in a podcast with former Obama aide David Axelrod. So I think she maybe let her guard down, where she said that often they counseled him not to answer reporters' questions. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. What shifted? So that was like one of the first stories. Clearly, they saw it as a political issue, and I wrote about that a bunch. But when I actually started being like, maybe like something's actually off, that this isn't just like a political strategy, because the Biden team would be like, well, this is actually a new media strategy that you don't understand, and the legacy media.
You idiots
And the
don't
legacy.
understand the strategy of how modern technology requires you to never speak to the press in an unguarded way ever.
Exactly. Like, literally, that was their argument: is that you
That's
don't
how Donald Trump
understand.
made it so big, and why Joe Rogan is the biggest podcaster in the country.
They were like, you don't, basically, they're like, you don't understand that you don't matter anymore. That was their argument. And a lot of reporters, I gotta say,
Which
like,
would be fair if instead of talking to Axios and CNN, they were talking
sure,
to a lot of new media outlets, right?
100%. Like, does the New York Times and ABC News matter as much as it did 30 years ago? Like, no, it doesn't. But does it? But it wasn't like they were having him do a podcast, like 3 podcasts a day either. They would occasionally have him do one to sort of sell this narrative that it was all part of a strategy, a strategy. But and the reality was, it was because he had limitations now. He could not do what he used to do. And then obviously the other, it vacillated between, this is a new media strategy, or he has a stutter. And it's a lifelong stutter. They're sort of like, sort of using, they basically insinuating you're ableist if you are like asking questions about this. And those were sort of their two main go-tos. I'd say the second moment when I became concerned, and this was more investigative, was basically in early 2023, I think, as not the inner circle, but a few rungs, like the rungs right below it, they realized that Joe Biden was actually going to do this, that Joe Biden was going to run again. And they became concerned. And that's when the first real leaks to me started coming, because they had been they saw that like it was very difficult both publicly and privately, to schedule any events outside, around 10 to 4. And they were like, and it wasn't a strategy, it was his energy. And they were like, these people, I still think in their heads, they were like, he can still be president, but like they did not believe they had, or at least they had serious concerns about him being president until January of 2029, and his ability to run really do a re-election campaign, which is exhausting. And so those were the two moments and now I'm giving you sort of a Joe Biden-esque long answer, but those were the two moments.
You sound a little more coherent, don't worry. So you did write about this early on. I guess what strikes me about this whole story is the vast distance between how most voters felt and how, insiders perceived the situation, which is to say that, even by the time that Joe Biden was running for president in 2020, it was quite obvious from his performance in debates, from his appearances on Zoom, that he wasn't the same man as he had been, 20 or 10 or even 4 years earlier. Now, that didn't mean that at that point it was in any way obvious that he had very, strong form of mental decline. I'm not sure that he did in 2020, but I think a lot of people already felt that there had been a change. By the time it was a year or two later, it had changed drastically. I mean, I remember, sitting in an audience at the Aspen Ideas Festival of all things in what would have been the summer of perhaps 2022. Karl Rove asking the audience, do you want Joe Biden to run it? Do you like Joe Biden? Nearly all hands went up. Do you think he's doing a decent job? A lot of hands went up. Do you think that he's too old? Nearly all hands went up. Do you want him to run again? Nearly no hands went up, right? So, even an audience that was very well disposed towards him had a visceral sense by at least the summer of 2022 that he just didn't have it in him for another 4 years. And that he had, whatever medical term you want to put on it or not put on it, aged in ways that made it very hard for him to be president, or to continue certainly to be president for another 4 years. And yet, sort of, the more you ascended the scale of access and the scale of prestige, the less people seemed to be talking and writing about that, right? Like, you went to your local Democratic Party neighborhood association, people probably talked about it quite openly. You had, a lunch with a bunch of New York Times writers, people probably didn't talk about it, or at least they, and the same within the Democratic Party. So what is it? Why did that cognitive distance emerge between ordinary people who had quite limited evidence to go on, but who largely, I think, called it correctly, and people who had more access, more ability to ask people about what was going on, more ability to be exposed to him, who somehow seem to have realized this later on?
That's such a great question. I'm going to sort of word vomit at you because I have a few different thoughts. Because I saw the exact same thing in that I remember, when the Wall Street Journal, that published their big story, and people forget, like, their big story about Biden's age. It was like 3 weeks before the debate. And not only the entire Democratic Party publicly attacked them, but like a lot of like fellow reporters also like threw shade publicly and privately. And I remember the headline on that story is something like, "Behind closed doors, Biden shows signs of slipping." And my reaction was like, behind closed doors, and I remember saying that to other reporters, and like, I saw exactly what you're describing, like this, like, discomfort. Like, we don't talk about that. Like, there was like sort of embarrassment. I guess I think part of it, is, and I think reporters are defensive and in denial about some of this, is like, it's the access game, right? Like, the closer you get to access, the more you are willing to, like, defend the people that are giving you that access, right? Or believe them also, because they, like everyone in the Biden White House that had regular access to him, was not telling the truth. And I intentionally don't use the word lie because I do sort of believe it's like getting into motives that you can't know. Like, was it self-delusion? Was it like intentional covering up? I do think it was, regardless, I think it's fair to call it deception. Even if they, given that the ways that they orchestrated him to not make him look old. I also think there is an old expression, I think it's attributed to former Senator Gary Hart, Democratic senator from Colorado, but I'm sure other people have said versions of it, which is that Washington is always the last to get the news. And that voters, and my entire time in Washington since 2013 has proven that to be true over and over again. And this is just like the latest example of it, right? And the increasing, as local news dies, as, like national media becomes increasingly concentrated in DC and New York, it does seem in some ways that the disconnect grows. But even so, even with voters, obviously very concerned, I do think that everyone saw that he was in decline. The extent of the decline, I do think, was fairly well hidden. If you read the book, the Biden that we saw on the debate stage, that was not the first time he acted like that behind closed doors, and it wasn't even close to the first time he acted like that behind closed doors. And he had moments that were similar, but I think the fact that it was still, even with voters speaking very clearly, I still think the extent of the decline was shocking.
Well, one of the things that I found really striking in the book, which I hadn't quite understood about the story before reading it, was how few people had any kind of access to Joe Biden himself in the last 2 or so years of his presidency. It was obvious that the White House was limiting occasions on which Biden would appear in public. It was obvious that he wasn't performing great on those, but many of those were so scripted that beyond sort of having just a very clear gut reaction, but this is not the Joe Biden we've seen in the past, it was hard to assess until the debate sort of the extent of his public decline. But I guess one thing that you were thinking in the background, and I was early on the record to say that Biden should not run again and that there's very obvious problems with his mental state. But I probably underestimated the extent of the problem, in part because you sort of assume, well, but behind closed doors, he must be meeting with all of these people. And sort of, it's interesting, even if you didn't want to write about, the extent of his mental decline, that there were so few stories in the media about, the average Democratic senator hasn't spoken to Joe Biden in 2 years. I mean, there's all of these amazing quotes you got from people who, see the debate in June 2024 or have some kind of meeting with him at some point around that time. And, they're gobsmacked by what he's like because they haven't laid eyes on him in 2 years. And these are not, the chairman of a Democratic Party in some county that only is relevant, when there's an election coming up. I mean, these are like United States senators and really powerful people in the party.
Yeah, cabinet members too. I mean, we have one cabinet member that basically said almost all access to members of the cabinet was shut off beginning in late 2023. And one cabinet member told us that they had this meeting, in 2024, a rare meeting, and they were stunned. And that they describe exactly what you saw on the debate stage: slack-jawed, meandering, completely off topic. Also, we had a senior White House official. And honestly, this interview, I still remember the moment because it was, when Jake Tapper and I decided to write this book, we basically, it was just on a hunch. We had not done, it was on November 6th. we were like, there's more to this story about Biden, and like, let's try. And so we pitched it not knowing what we were going to get. And I remembered this very distinctly, this one interview where a senior White House official, one of those people that like, I tried to talk to forever, but never responded. And then this person, who left in 2024, confessed that they left because they thought it was irresponsible to run for re-election, and also confessed that the top aides of the White House were intentionally shielding him, not just from voters, but from senior members of the Democratic Party and senior members of his own White House administration, so they could not see the extent of the decline and would try to only show him at his very best moments, which often took place in the middle of the day.
So one of the great things about the book is that it's a really compelling narrative, and that makes it a great read. And I think you're understandably very careful about making judgments and imputing motives to people, because that's hard to do. But it is one of the questions that any reader of a book is going to ask themselves, right? And presumably we can sort of divide people up into a few categories, right? So off the top of my head, one category is fully aware of the fact that Joe Biden is in serious mental decline and working to obscure that fact. The next is, in denial about, the extent to which that is the case, but still complicit in protecting, quote unquote, Biden from too much public scrutiny because they're worried about it, right? And then you get to, somewhat concerned about it, but, as much lied to as lying, right? As much allowing yourself to be talked into, while I sort of have a bad gut feeling, I guess everybody's telling me that it's fine, and so I guess it must be fine. And, I'm going to slightly overstate my confidence in that when I'm in front of voters, if I'm an elected official, but, I'm basically kind of duped, to the true believers who are just like, any concerns about Biden's mental health is just a Fox News conspiracy, and this is all just ridiculous, right? Who falls into which of those categories? I mean, we don't have to sort of go name by name, right? But like, who are the people who you think sort of did know what was going on, and when they were looking in the mirror, they knew what they were doing, and who are the people who fell into some of the categories that were further in the direction of delusion, self-delusion, extreme naivete, whatever you want to call it.
Honestly, I'm gonna dodge your question a little bit. Not because I don't have, it's just because I agree with what you're saying. Is you don't want to put intention into people's minds, but I will say, but I'm gonna try to answer it the best way I can, which is that the people that saw Joe Biden the most, and I'm going to name their names, would be Bruce Reed, his top policy advisor, Steve Ricchetti, both his friend and top legislative advisor, Mike Donilon, his top political advisor, Anthony Bernal, the First Lady's top political advisor, Annie Tomasini, basically sort of like a traveling chief of staff, manages him in general. These are all people that have been with Joe Biden for a long time. These are the 5 most powerful people in the White House. And they are all, I think, live by, and I also include Jill Biden in there, and they all live and die by their loyalty to him, by his praise. If you go in the next layer out, you have people like Chief of Staff Jeff Zients, Anita Dunn, and honestly, like there's not many other people in that second category, and maybe those are people that I think they're not like ride or die Biden people, like their entire political career is not connected to Joe Biden, but they still had significant access, and you could argue as a result maybe should have known better, but also didn't have the same level of influence with the principal because of the fact they aren't ride or die Biden. Now, I think I'll give you, to answer sort of your question though, There are, if you want to give people the benefit of the doubt, there is one rationale, especially for this inner circle, and even like that second circle I talked about. One is, if you believe that Donald Trump is an existential threat to democracy, you can rationalize anything. And that's what they were doing. They were saying Joe Biden would be a better president at 86 years old than Donald Trump would be. And if we change anything up, we are making that potentially more likely. And also, I remember somebody, and they had not talked to Jeff Zients, the chief of staff, but somebody that knows him was, sort of said, okay, so if you're Jeff Zients, this was just theoretical. They were like, if you're Jeff Zients, what are your two options? Or what are your options if you don't think Joe Biden should run? You could confront him privately, which I think the book very clearly shows almost nobody, with the exception of Tony Blinken, really, and even his was sort of a light touch, confronted Joe Biden about running again. You could go public, but then I think that's like sort of the nuclear option. And then I don't think anyone thought they were going to change him or the family's mind about running. And it was only going to hurt Biden politically and help Trump. So that's like the generous version, is that sort of the specter of Trump allowed people to justify putting a guy that clearly could not do the job he was running for 4 more years to be silent. The less charitable version is... Oh, sorry. You were going to say something?
No, go say the last sentence and then...
okay. So the less charitable version is that they all had their own self-interest in keeping Joe Biden in the White House, both monetarily and their own significance and their own power. If you're ride or die for Biden, especially, then that whole crew, that was going to be the end. That was going to be the capstone of their career. And they were talking themselves into something, putting this guy in the Oval Office for 4 more years because it was in their self-interest.
A lot of the inner circles also had children and nephews and whatever else working in the administration. So there was another layer of self-interest in a rather strange way. So let's think about these kind of different modes of explanation, right? I've argued in the past, and I wonder whether you agree or disagree with that, that for a lot of journalists, this idea that Joe Biden was, the only thing that's standing between us and Donald Trump was quite a powerful motivator. I worry about the extent to which many journalists have come to think of themselves as defenders of democracy, not because I don't care about democracy or not because I don't think that as private citizens trying to stand up for and to fight for democracy is a noble cause, but because it makes it very tempting to try and frame every story in such a way that no reader of the story could possibly come to the wrong conclusion, which is to vote for somebody who's as dangerous to democracy as Donald Trump. And of course, the irony of this whole story is that concern made much more likely the re-election of Donald Trump. That at least if you think that is part of the motivation for what was going on with some of the journalists here, then the fact that they did not write much more openly about concerns with Joe Biden, about the extent to which it was hard to get access to him, about the extent to which people in his cabinet weren't getting access to him, is that he could try and run again for 2024, and that's what meant that we didn't have an open primary in 2024, which both meant that we got stuck with a candidate who had proven quite unpopular in the polls and didn't do very well in the 2020 primaries, and frankly that candidate didn't have the time and the opportunity to grow into a stronger candidate, as she may have done over the course of a competitive primary system. So, to what extent do you think that perhaps not the beat reporters who are in the White House core, who are competing for scoops, that may be some of them, but the op-ed writers, the news anchors, the MSNBC talking heads, all of the other kinds of people who are really influential in creating a kind of climate of opinion, were holding back because of what I think is quite a culpable sort of dereliction of professional duty, but is, as they would have thought of it in their own terms, was kind of noble goal of, trying to preserve the democratic system from the dangers it faces?
And not getting into, because I think some people talk about the media as if it's all one big blob of things. And I think there are individual actors at all of these places that are like the best and toughest journalists around. And I worked with them. But yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think people let the Trump of it all sort of into their heads. And, it's like, I also agree that it's just not, in my opinion. Some people disagree, and that's fine, but I just don't think it's the job to convince people that Trump is a threat to democracy. You report what you can and like let voters make up their minds about it, rather than sort of putting spin on the ball. I mean, if you keep telling people this is, I mean, to varying degrees. And you could argue that it's much more now than before, but like democracy is always under threat in America. And I just think it's way too simplistic, and I do think it affected the Biden coverage in a way that I think, as you said, like, ended up helping Trump in the end.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, I mean, I think one, it is a dereliction of the kind of professional duties that journalists should have, which is to tell the truth.
Yeah.
But the second thing is that I think it actually is really self-undermining. I think it comes from a huge overestimation of the influence that journalists can have, right? It's, if we don't talk about this, people are not going to care about it, we're not going to worry about it. But, the average voter worried about it long before the New York Times wrote about it regularly. And then obviously in the debate, it all came out. So
I completely agree with this point. I completely agree. It's like, if we don't talk about it, voters aren't going to know. No one's going to know. And sorry, I interrupted you, but I completely agree with this point.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, and the actual thing is like, if we don't talk about it, people are going to stop believing us and stop trusting us, which is actually very bad for democracy. I mean, so that's one kind of level, right? I mean, the op-ed writer who, privately does worry a little bit about what's going on with Biden, but doesn't want to go there because it just somehow might help Trump in a vague sense. Let's just focus on something else, right? I mean, the level of deception required, or perhaps the level of self-deception required for people who are close to Biden is completely different, right? I mean, here we're talking about people who are daily in contact with him,
Yep.
Who are very well aware of the mental lapses he has, who are putting systems in place for limiting his contact, even with, allies, certainly for stage managing his public appearances. What were they thinking? I mean, to take one example that I've really been trying to get my head around, Jill Biden. She's somebody who clearly cares deeply about her husband, with whom she's been married for many decades. Is clearly, a very loyal spouse and partner. I find it very hard to fathom how somebody who loves their husband can, and who observes both the extent of mental decline from which he's suffering, and obviously the ways in which the immense pressures of a job like the presidency must be accelerating that decline, could possibly wish for her spouse to be subjected to that for another 4 years. I mean, how is it that somebody like Joe Biden cannot just justify this to the country, justify this to herself? How is it that her concern for her husband's well-being doesn't take priority over, whatever the motivation was for trying to win him another term?
I mean, this is the question that so many people that have worked for Joe Biden and love Joe Biden, still to this day, have been asking themselves and raging about ever since the last debate, because there is this feeling of how, like, and Biden, like a lot of old people, he had good hours and bad hours, good days and bad days. And, they were clearly managing him in a way to try to make sure when he was in public and big stakes, like at the State of the Union just a few months before, the debate, that he was at his best. But even if you see him so often, like the First Lady did, this is how someone described it to me at the time. If you see him so regularly, and you think there's even a 10% chance that he is going to act that way on the debate stage, if you love him, how do you let him go out on that stage? And there are lots of different theories. Some I'll just sort of broaden it out and tell you what other people who know them have said. Some people think that she fell in love with the life. She had as many Vogue covers in 4 years as Michelle Obama had in 8. The glamour of the job. Someone put it to me like she got Jackie O'd. She was like, oh, I can be sort of a first lady, like an iconic first lady. And
it is amazing how much self-delusion there was in this White House, right? I mean, from the first 2 years of the presidency, where everybody was comparing Joe Biden to FDR, and he's like completely reconstructing whatever, and then comparing Jill Biden to Jacqueline Kennedy. I mean, it's immense extent of self-delusion. Sorry.
No, I think it comes from the chip on the shoulder that Joe Biden had and extended to all the people around him were all people that had felt disrespected for a long time. And once they won, they were like, we're going to show you, we're better than Obama. We're better than Clinton. We are FDR. And so, the more sympathetic version is towards Jill Biden. Is, to be clear, also, she is not I think Lady Macbeth has been used as, I don't think that's right, because Jill Biden, while she fell in love with the life, never, at least in our reporting, was never like obsessed with power, right? Like, she wasn't like scheming. She had no like policy priorities, really. Like, she may have enjoyed sort of the trappings of power, but Biden, don't deny him agency, is what some other people have told us, is like, he wanted to do it, and she was the enforcer. She was, and through her top aide, Anthony Bernal, was, basically enforced loyalty, quieted dissent, and excommunicated naysayers, or people that even raised questions. And so she is like a pivotal role. She will go down, and I think the way that she wanted, as one of the more consequential first ladies in American history. And her top aide will probably go down as the most powerful aide to a first lady in American history.
One episode that really struck me at the time we were living through it, but particularly in retrospect reading your book, was the sort of tragic figure of Robert Hur, who was the special counsel who was supposed to investigate Joe Biden taking home some classified documents to his home in Delaware, who decided not to prosecute Joe Biden for that, which got him attacked from parts of the political right, but who, as part of explaining why he didn't want to do that, said that Joe Biden, if he was put on the defense stand in some trial, would likely, say that he is a sort of, elderly gentleman who doesn't fully recall everything, and that would make him a very sympathetic defendant. And he mentioned that, in this deposition, Joe Biden at times, didn't have full mental clarity. A lot of the White House machine attacked Robert Hur as, a liar, as somebody who was a political henchman, who was just out to get Joe Biden, with real career consequences for Robert Hur. And there's a whole slew of opinion-making media in the United States, from MSNBC to places further in the center-left and the center, who echoed those kind of attacks. Tell us about both what the truth of that was to set the record straight, but also about who some of the people were who were complicit in that character assassination.
Yeah, so I mean, it's certainly just a classic story of a person who tells the truth is punished for it. And I remember even somebody inside the White House later on, they said, like, he said the thing and no one could unsay it. And he finally was the one, with like the credibility to say it, and that's why they attacked him so hard. So some background here. So Robert Hur, so in the aftermath of the FBI raid of Mar-a-Lago to take back classified documents from Donald Trump, Joe Biden goes on 60 Minutes, and this is, I think, September of 2022, and says that Trump was incredibly irresponsible in his handling. And then in November, right before the midterm elections, Biden's own lawyers realized that he has a bunch of classified documents, and not just in one place, in like 3 different places, including his garage next to his car. So, given Biden's comments about, and then also Donald Trump then runs for president, says he's going to run for president right after the midterms. So given what Biden had already said publicly about the Trump investigation, and given what the facts are about Biden, Merrick Garland decides to appoint a special counsel. And this is Robert Hur. Robert Hur and his deputy eventually tracked down Joe Biden's former ghostwriter, who, it's a longer, messier story, but had deleted some of the audio files in early 2023, but then they were able to restore them. But anyways, so Robert Hur and his deputy begin listening to Joe Biden talking to his ghostwriter in 2017. And they are stunned. They feel like this guy is out of it. This is sort of troubling. Fast forward to October of 2023, they sit down with Joe Biden for, it's a 2-part interview, about 5 hours, and they can't believe what they're seeing. The 2017 Joe Biden seems cogent in comparison to the president now that they are seeing in real life. And also, Joe Biden is on tape in 2017 telling his ghostwriter, I have all the classified stuff downstairs. Essentially an on-the-record confession that he had taken, after his vice president, he had taken classified documents away from the White House and kept them for himself. And so Robert Hur basically concludes that Joe Biden likely broke the law, but is not going to recommend prosecuting him because he's essentially too addled to be found guilty. And the people most responsible for trying to slime and undermine Robert Hur, you mentioned the consequences. Man couldn't find work for a lot of months after this. I would say a combination of certainly like Anita Dunn. Certainly people like Hunter Biden and Jill Biden and the entire family that instructed. The entire family was so upset they instructed the White House to try to go full throttle. Joe Biden, including the night after the report goes out, and Robert Hur had said that in multiple instances, Joe Biden didn't remember the year his son died. And Joe Biden goes out in front of the public and lies. And I don't like to use that word. He lied, or he was too addled to remember what the truth was, which is that. And Joe Biden says, when Robert Hur brought this up, I thought it was none of his business. Robert Hur never brought up Biden. Joe Biden brought it up himself. But Joe Biden used the death of his son in 2015 to try to undermine and ruin the career of Robert Hur. That's what happened. And so I think most of the culpability lies in those like top circles. There were certainly many aides that helped that along. Ian Sams, who's recently been called or asked to testify in front of the Republican-led Oversight Committee, was sort of leading comms underneath Anita Dunn on that issue. I also think if you look, I'm more sympathetic to the media coverage pre-her of Biden. Post-her, the coverage of Joe Biden's age, I thought was really bad, and the ways that some of the media, if you go back and look at how they covered her report and then also covered the release of the transcript, I just think it was, I don't think it ages well.
So you mentioned Beau Biden and Hunter Biden. One of the tragedies of Joe Biden's life and one of the sort of strange tragedies of his story as a whole is that, Beau Biden was the kind of, chosen successor, the smart, successful, hardworking, rising politician who was the presumptive successor to Joe Biden's political career. He was kind of a golden boy who tragically passed away from a serious disease. Now, one of the interesting things that you chronicle in the book is that actually Beau and Joe Biden lied about the extent of Beau Biden's disease when he was, Attorney General of Delaware. So there's actually a long history in the family of trying to occlude the true extent of serious medical conditions. But Beau Biden is certainly a tragic and sympathetic figure. And the son who survives is Hunter Biden, who clearly is somebody who has many affecting qualities, who's deeply beloved by his family, but who is not the golden boy, is the person who has serious substance abuse issues, who is trading on his father's name in order to make the money that he spends in a very lavish manner, who lies in his application for a gun permit about the extent of his or the existence of his drug abuse problems, etc. How does this whole sort of melodrama of Hunter Biden, his obvious misdeeds, and his father's inability to, give up hope that he might somehow be reformed, shape those years?
We talked a little bit about Jill Biden before, but Hunter Biden was one of the most consequential advisors during Joe Biden's time. Not necessarily, again,
and that's another shocking thing that I didn't realize before. I mean, that I thought, Joe Biden, the sympathetic reading is that Joe Biden is allowing himself to be used in all kinds of ways by his son, and because of the genuinely tragic nature of the Biden family story, Joe Biden is not able to tell his son, stop doing this, stop doing that, etc. But the extent to which Hunter Biden actually wielded influence within the White House is really shocking.
Very, very much so. And, again, it is similar to Jill in that it's not necessarily on like policy direction, but in terms of enforcement, maintaining loyalty and direction. And, I think also on what the decision to run again. I think in some ways, I'll step back for a second. So Hunter Biden, you put it very well. There was like an heir and a spare quality to him and Beau Biden. And when Beau dies, Hunter wants to fill that void. He wants to become the heir, right? He wants to run for mayor of Wilmington. He wants to go and take care of his niece and nephew, Beau's kids, and the way that his aunt did for him and Beau. He's also, he's obviously made a lot of money. He wants to sort of support the family. He wants to fill this void. And he obviously fails spectacularly. Ends up, having a relationship with Beau's widow, messy divorce with his wife, does not run for mayor, eventually, spirals into a really, really deep crack addiction and introduces Beau's widow to crack cocaine as well. And I think, and then becomes, the laptop is a whole other thing, but essentially, has all of the self-documentation of that spiral leaked online for all of his father's political opponents to mine through. And now is also under legal, federal investigation by his dad's Justice Department. And I think, the thing about Hunter's spiral that I don't think is recognized enough is that when Joe Biden ran for president in 2019, when he announced in the spring of 2019, they didn't even really know where Hunter was. He was completely off the rails. Hunter's sobriety date, as he's testified in court, that this was his sobriety date, was literally 2.5 weeks after Joe Biden officially gets in the race. Hunter's sobriety and getting himself together is completely intertwined with his father's political, presidential run and his presidential legacy. So it's not that big of a surprise that Hunter would also be completely on board with Joe Biden running again. This is part of his larger, this is me putting him on the couch a little bit, but I've spent a little time with Hunter. Hunter saw in his and his dad a chance at redemption. For everything he'd put his family through, for everything he'd done just in general. And, I think he becomes an enabler of the decision to run again, and also an enforcer of anyone that has any doubts about this should be pushed aside.
I saw Hunter Biden speak at a very strange convening that I attended in the fall of 2024, in the run-up to the presidential election. It seemed like a strange time for Hunter Biden to go in front of an audience of hundreds of people to speak about his personal story. And I have to say that I was surprised at that point by how evidently sober, cogent, in some way affecting he was in talking about his personal story. Given that I had a rather negative opinion of him, in light of all the things we know about him. But I do wonder to what extent, from Hunter Biden's perspective, his father being president was an insurance policy against going to jail. Joe Biden had not pardoned him until after he lost re-election. And it must have seemed to Hunter Biden that one reason to make sure that his father ran for office and, hopefully would gain a second term is that if he really should be on the way to jail, his father could pardon him, as eventually he did, even though he did not run for re-election and was on the way out of the White House.
Completely agree. I think this is, again, one of those questions of, is it self-interest or are they being honest about their intentions? And yeah, I think, Joe Biden, I think that there was part of Joe Biden's motivation to run for president again was to make sure that Hunter didn't go to jail, because they believed, with some reason, by the way, but they believed that, if Trump won, then he would throw Hunter in jail and throw members of his family in jail. And, the thing about Joe Biden's political career that's been shown over and over again is, at the end of the day, I think Joe Biden has a line of like, family is the beginning, the middle, and the end. Um, and he was always going to prioritize his family over everything else. And I do think also, Hunter Biden, and this gets more into sort of the manipulative behaviors of an addict, would tell Joe Biden that the Republicans and Trump are continuing to attack him in order to try to make him relapse and commit suicide. And you can't let them do that. And I think that was also a factor in this equation.
That's fascinating. I know that is not the focus of your book, but one of the things I grapple with in thinking about Joe Biden and his legacy is that, I think I'm instinctively drawn to a relatively sympathetic reading of him, which is that he was a devoted public servant for many decades, that he certainly would have had opportunities to make a bunch of money that he did not pursue, including after he left office in 2016. I think he generally wanted to make the country a better place and so on. Then there's the much more cynical reading of him, which is that he at the very least was complicit in the ways in which his son and other members of the family were making money off of the Biden name. But he did join meetings with business partners of Hunter Biden, in which it was very clear that he was lending the imprimatur of the then vice president of the United States to those enterprises, that he never said to his son, I love you and I support you through whatever you do, but if you take on this role as a board member of Burisma, it is very clearly going to read as an influence peddling situation, particularly since you don't have any obvious geopolitical expertise and no obvious expertise in the energy industry, and so you resign today. You're not taking that job. What do you think the right reading of Biden's entanglement in these issues are? Was he, the decent public servant who was unaware of those things? Was he the doting father who just didn't know how to say no to his son? Or do you think that there was a more selfish component to trying to make sure that his family had financial resources and profited in various ways from his name and position of influence?
Oh man, all the above. I mean, I think when it comes to Biden, and honestly, which way I lean on those two interpretations, honestly, like it depends on the day. Depends who I've just recently talked to. And it's not a dodge. It honestly is because like I think he is like a very complicated person. The family's very complicated. Like, but I do think when it came to the family, they rationalized so much and felt it was them against the world and they were owed it and it didn't matter. And, like other people get away with more, right? That's like how a lot of people like rationalize their own behavior. It's like, well, there's like this fascinating, it's like the one email that comes to mind, this from the laptop, but it was reported in I think it was reported everywhere, but the one story that comes to mind is the Washington Post is like, when Obama wins, they make Hunter get rid of his lobbying practice because they're worried about appearances. And Hunter deeply resents the Obama people for this. After the 2012 election, Jim Messina, who had been the campaign manager for Obama's 2012 reelection, goes out and starts, working for a bunch of like very rich companies. And Hunter has this email where he like rails against this. And he's so upset because like, you guys made me give up my thing, but you guys are now doing something similar. And I do think the self-rationalization when it comes to family and excusing inexcusable behavior because it's them against the world. That chip on the shoulder just, is omnipresent in their psyche. I think that's a big part of the story. But I also go and like am sometimes, as far as like presidents go and like being pretty earnest and well-meaning, like Joe Biden's like pretty high up there. Like I think there is like an earnestness to him that that I think is the reason why he won in general. I mean, some of it's COVID and everything else, but like I think if you go around the country, people are like, I think majority are like, I think he's a good guy. I think polls have showed that too. And I think over 50 plus years of public service, I think that has come through. So sometimes, I'm of two minds, and honestly, it'll be for historians to like figure it out. But I'm confused about it sometimes.
Interesting. So we get the famous debate, end of June of 2024. It's an unmitigated disaster. Some people immediately realize 10, 15 minutes in, this guy can't possibly run for president. Other people take longer to come to that position. You tell very well in the book the story of how that debate scrambles everything in the Democratic Party, leads, I think, a lot of people who were trying to rationalize things to themselves, who perhaps hadn't been in a lot of contact with Biden, even for one would expect that they might have been given the kind of position they held, to realize that the jig was really up. I'm interested. We don't need to retrace that whole story. I think if people want to do that, they should read the book. But I'm interested in a few things about the weeks that follow onto that. One is that just the basic coalitional politics here, right? I mean, when Biden gets elected in 2020, he's a moderate candidate. And he then, in sort of moving towards the middle after the primary election campaign, kind of moves to the left and incorporates, appoints a lot of Elizabeth Warren's people in key positions in the White House, sort of makes nice with the left of the party in various ways that go beyond the usual consolidation of a political party usually get after a primary nominating contest. And so, I guess that helps to explain part of it. But one of the really strange things about those weeks after Joe Biden does disasters in the debate is that it's actually relatively moderate Democratic Party politicians who tend to say this is not going to work. And some of the very last people to defend him are, if I'm remembering right, Bernie Sanders, AOC, people on the really progressive wing of the party. And I just didn't understand that at the time. I'm not sure that I fully understand that now. They're not complicit in Biden. They're not hanging out with him every day. They don't have anything to cover for, right? Like nobody's going to tell them, why'd you lie to us about Joe Biden? Why don't they say the truth at that point and instead have this delusion that we can somehow defend Biden at that point?
There are a few reasons. I'd say the most, naked one is just self-interest, is that the reason why the Democratic Party freaks out, and no one should get, I think very few people in the Democratic Party should get many points for courage after the debate, because they weren't speaking out or raising concerns about like his fitness for the job, most of them, or about his ability to do the job in 2029. They were doing it because they were like, he can't win and he's going to bring us down with him. So part of the reason why, the moderate Democrats are freaking out more now, back then, is because they're in vulnerable seats, right? Like they're seeing their own.
The progressives are sitting in seats that they're definitely going to win. So
yes. Yeah. So that's that's the most basic reason. But also your point is very well taken, is that shocking to anybody that had observed Joe Biden, especially in the 80s and 90s, he had cultivated a real loyalty and allegiance among the Congressional Progressive Caucus and among most of the progressives. And, this is mostly, I mean, usually candidates, after they win the primary, they pivot to the middle. Joe Biden in 2020 was in the center in the primary and then pivoted to the left. And the theory of the case when he did that was that you don't want to, in some ways you could argue this is like over-learning past lessons, is like, we don't want a repeat of 2016 when they felt that the Bernie folks ended up really hurting Hillary. And then when he gets in and governs, and some senior administration officials, including cabinet members, believed that Joe Biden had been 20 years younger, he would have governed differently because given the limitations on his time and his energy, he deferred a lot to staff, and very much including Ron Klain, who comes more from the progressive wing of the party. And Ron, prioritized progressive, like, relationships with the progressive caucus, believing, especially with the narrow margins in Congress, that you had to keep the left on board.
And another element of this surely is that, there's been a lot of conversations about the quote-unquote groups after the November 2024 elections, about the influence that all of these activist groups and so on have had on the Democratic Party. And it takes political courage to stand up to those groups. Now, that's something that it's easier for a principal, for somebody who's actually elected, who's the face in the elected office to do, than for aides to do. So, when the principal is absent, and when the principal has elected, has appointed a lot of people from different wings of a party into key positions, even the people who might have more moderate instincts may just not be in a position to have the leadership, the decision-making power, the agency to say, no, we're going to say no to those groups, right? Like the way that you'd expect that to happen most of the time is that aides come to a senator, a congressman, a governor, a president, and say, we're being pushed to do this thing, perhaps we should just do it, and the president or the governor or whatever says no, right? Like, this may be our own faction's, interest or desire or whatever, but I actually am standing for all of the people in my state or all of the people in my country. I have my own political instincts, and those say this is a bad idea. And in the absence of that principle, it's just harder to resist that kind of pressure.
I think that's a very fair and well-taken point. Yeah, I think that did affect things.
So you get this sort of strange few weeks in which there are some, very passionate defenders of Biden running again. A lot of people are kind of scrambling, running around how they can stop him from running again without having to display any courage. Eventually he is pushed out and Kamala Harris is installed very, very quickly as his successor. There's many interesting parts about how that comes about as well. But what I want to focus on right now is sort of where's Kamala Harris in all of this? She is touted as a very key member of the administration early on. There's a year or two in which every press release, everything is, the Biden-Harris administration, which is very unusual compared to previous administrations. She also seems to be marginalized in the administration relatively early on. There was a particularly embarrassing moment when Joe Biden was diagnosed with COVID, and there was a press release to inform the American public that thankfully they did not have to worry about the health of the vice president since she had not met with him anytime recently. To what extent did she have access to Joe Biden? I mean, presumably she must have been in all kinds of situations where she did get a sense of Joe Biden's state earlier on. And why does she refrain from criticizing him all the way through? I mean, I guess I see why, as the sitting vice president, it is hard for her to level with the public, especially why Joe Biden is still about to be the nominee. Politically, I see how it's hard for her. For moral, you might think that she had to. Why, even when she becomes a candidate, does she remain so reluctant to criticize Biden not only on this issue, but also on the substance of the policies that he had pursued in his office, which were proving to be unpopular?
So many good questions in there. I'd say, Kamala Harris's team and the White House's team overstated her access and influence in the administration. Now, I think Joe Biden very much instructed his team to say Biden-Harris administration to at least publicly give her credit, even if it was more, because he was still living with the memories of feeling, not properly appreciated by the Obama administration. And I think that being said, even if she didn't have as much access as they said, she still did have access and did see him and was in these meetings. I'd also say that Joe Biden also overstated his access with Obama. I was always the last person in the room for every decision. That's not true. And Kamala Harris, it's unclear, she had lunches with him often. Her influence was limited, her access was limited. But she also became, in many ways, one of the tips of the spear, or tips of the spears, when in the aftermath of the Her report. She goes out there, decides she's going to back Biden the entire way, and essentially call Robert Hur a liar. And she didn't have to do that. She was a main validator. I think, Kamala Harris, I think also was made a political calculation that loyalty to Joe Biden, she could not show any distant, her entire vice presidency. I'm not going to show almost any distance between me and Joe Biden. Because I also think, she rightly said, Joe Biden's endorsement, if and when I run for president, matters everything. And I also think she also genuinely felt loyalty to him. And I think that muscle memory, once she becomes the nominee, and also Joe Biden basically effectively ended all of Pelosi and Obama's dreams of an open process when he endorsed Kamala Harris. I think she also felt loyalty to him for doing that.
So Kamala Harris was, took the right strategic call for how to be installed as the candidate of the Democratic Party, right? And presumably in the early stages of the presidency, she assumed, as did many Americans, that Joe Biden would eventually step down, and then obviously his support for her acceding as the nominee would prove crucial. And then, it's interesting that she didn't have any form of disloyalty sort of in the period between, let's say, late 2023 and the middle of 2024, when it looked like Joe Biden was going to run again. But I guess she didn't want to risk being unselected as the vice presidential candidate or anything like that. And, I guess she didn't think that she had the electoral strength to unseat him if she challenged him in a primary or something like that, or that took too much courage, too much foresight. It would have been a great way for her to actually prove her mettle in retrospect. It is striking that even after all of that, she then ended up not doing anything about the two big forms of political vulnerability that she had in the actual campaign. The first of which is that, famously when she was asked in one key interview, in one of the very few interviews she gave, at least Joe Biden was mentally unwell. You can sort of explain why he wasn't giving interviews. It's very hard to understand why Kamala Harris gave so few interviews early in her candidature, since she's clearly is not suffering from mental decline, one should hope. But she famously or infamously says that she can't really think of anything she would have done differently to Joe Biden. But the other thing that I think harmed her candidacy more than people wanted to recognize at the time is the fact that average voters must have been thinking to themselves, are you an idiot or are you a liar? Right? Did you not realize that Joe Biden is mentally not there? Or did you lie to us about it? And I don't think that Kamala Harris is an idiot. I think she must have realized it. But out of all of the understandable political calculus, she ended up not leveling about that with the American public, either before she was elevated to the nomination or after. And I think that cost her a lot of residual trust.
I mean, Hallie Jackson of NBC sat down with her, I think it was October of 2024, and basically said, like, asked sort of what you were asking, which was, and Kamala Harris was still relying on the line of, it was just a bad debate. It was just a bad night. And that's not, I think, if you take the really cynical view, and I'm not saying I have the reporting to support this, but like if you want to take the really cynical view, there was a decent chance if he got over the finish line, she would be president before 2029. And if you want to take a less cynical view than that, you could say that, she just thought she needed Joe's support in order to get the nomination, either in 2024 or 2028. And, or there's an explanation of like, she really didn't ever see him. And except for in a few moments. And so she thought he was basically the same as he was in 2020. But to your point, there are no good answers.
I've been struck by the fact that at least some of the reactions to your book have been, why are you writing about this? Why are you not writing about what Trump is doing at the moment? Which is very important for journalists to cover, and thankfully a lot of journalists are doing that very well. I'm sure you actually are doing it in some of your day-to-day work as a journalist as well. And it seems to me to miss two things. The first is that it's perfectly possible to chew and to walk and chew gum at the same time. That it's always a mistake, I think, in politics to say that you're only going to focus on one story when another story is also obviously interesting and fascinating and important. But the second is that I think it just underestimates how much trust was lost in the Democratic Party and, frankly, in the institutions of journalism as a result of this enormous lie that was told to the American people. What do you think it would take for Democrats, mainstream journalism, all of the different kind of institutions that in some way, more passive or active, were involved in this cover-up, to regain the trust of many Americans who are deeply disturbed by this?
I don't know. I think, I was always taught basically a version of like admitting errors builds trust, being defensive about them further erodes it. I still believe that. Clearly the Democratic Party at large, not everybody. I think there's been a few Democrats, Ro Khanna, a few others that have been like, we made a mistake. I don't think it's like a full confession, but they've certainly been like, that he should not have run for re-election, blah, blah, blah. But like, I don't know, a lot of the party, I would say like many of the leaders of the Democratic Party are just trying to yada yada their way through this and be like, now we have to focus on Trump. They're basically making the same argument. Like anytime I reported on Biden's age in 2023, they were making the same argument then. And now they're just being like, they're saying the same thing. And maybe that will work. I don't know. I mean, like a lot of Republicans tried and still do try to yada yada their way through what happened on January 6th, and they're back in power. So maybe it's a politically shrewd strategy. I don't know. But it's dishonest, and that's okay to call out. Most journalists are also very defensive and about their coverage of Biden and his age, and I think they, in all honesty, hide behind the screen of we talked about or we wrote about his age often, and that's true. They did, but they did mostly in the lens of it being a political liability in a horse race sense. There was very little investigative journalism about how his age was affecting his ability to do his job and how that would be exponentially exacerbated in his second term when he wanted to be president at 86 years old. And I think there's still like a lot of prickliness about that. And I've been a little bit disappointed.
Your book has been out for a little while at this point. It's been a big success. It has drawn a lot of attention. It seems to have sold very well. In terms of actually influencing how people think about this and the extent to which they're self-reflecting, how much of a difference do you think it's made? I mean, even before the book was published in reporting, do you feel like you sat across the table from people who said, "Oh my God, what have we done?" Who had some amount of genuine self-reflection and contrition? And do you think the Democratic Party more broadly has learned the lessons that would stop it? It's hard to think of an exactly analogous situation, but stop it from engaging in these kinds of levels of groupthink and levels of rallying the wagon, even if it involves deceiving the public? Or do you think this story is done? Joe Biden is out of public life. In a sense, all of this is only of historic interest. But the next time that a situation arises that is closely analogous or in some much more indirect way analogous, we're going to be back to square one.
We didn't write the book with the goal of getting a certain change one way or another. I think my sort of view of journalism is you want to we thought the story, Jake Tapper and I thought the story was worth telling for history and it was in the public interest. And I think journalists sometimes try to expand their role to certain outcomes. And I just don't think that's our job. And we should be humble about our role in this crazy, system mess of a country that's always been a mess, by the way. And I think, I didn't have any desired outcome other than to make people who were involved look in the mirror, which I think is journalism at its best, is you are holding up a mirror to people in power and saying, this is what happened. And, what the effect of it is, I don't know. I'm interested in it. I do think you're seeing a lot of Democrats talk more about age, you've had, I think 3 House Democrats die in their, because they ran for re-election when they were way too old. And now the Democrats are 3 votes short during a very consequential legislative fight. I think there could be political consequences and repercussions. But I did not write this book with maybe the exception of I strongly believe there should be more transparency about presidential health, which is beyond Joe Biden has been sort of a long time historical fascination for me about the secrets that presidents keep when it comes to their health. But beyond that, I really did not have a desired political outcome. But I am very interested in to see how people react to the reporting and whether or not they, act differently as a result.
Alex Thompson, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, especially when you're in Italy. I'm flattered that you'd take time out of, take 90 minutes out of being in Italy to talk to me about this passion project of mine and Jake's.